And right now, the award-winning screenwriter, director, and actor Sarah Polley joins me in our studio. How are you?
Thanks for having me. It was nice to hear my dad's voice.
I was going to say, what's that like for you?
It's really lovely. I haven't heard that in a while or seen the film, so it was nice hearing him.
Why was that at the top of the film?
I think that this book planted a lot of seeds for me that continued throughout the last 2 decades for me. And one of them was about narrative and why we need it and how we try to make sense of the bewildering nature of our lives by creating stories and how many versions there can be of the same story and what it means to be a reliable narrator, if there can ever be one. So that obviously were many of the themes and stories we tell that documentary. And there certainly began for me with reading Alias Grace and beginning to view the world in that way when I was 18.
Yeah, when was that? So do you remember, like, was it a moment where the Hallelujah chorus played in the background and this book appeared itself on the table?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually sent to me at the time by my agent, Celia Chassos, who's since retired, who is an extraordinary woman who, I had an acting career at that moment that seemed to be taking off. And she handed me this book and said, you need to get the rights to this and you need to do something other than act. And it was an extraordinary thing for an agent to do with an actor whose career was doing well. Yeah. But it really opened up worlds for me and I didn't know what she meant. But when I read it, it hooked me in such a way that I don't think I'd ever experienced anything like that before. It raised so many questions for me about the city I live in, about the history of the country I live in, about immigration, about class, about women. And I think it spoke to me about, things I wasn't understanding in myself and narratives I'd created around my own life or other people had that I didn't feel completely comfortable with.
So what do you mean? I don't understand what you mean by that.
I'm not going to tell you. No, I'm kidding. That's it. That's the messaging.
Well, that's Sarah Polley. Thanks a lot for coming in. I really, really appreciate that.
What I mean is I think that we create stories and narratives to make sense of our lives, and we need to not go crazy. Other people need to do it about us to have some sense of who we are in the context of the world. Yeah. But I think that they're kind of crutches, and I think that those narratives are always shifting. I'm not sure any of us really have any kind of fixed identity. So I think it spoke to me about ways I had found to be in the world to cope that may not have been completely genuine. Now, this is over 20 years of thinking about the book. I don't think that's what occurred to me at 18 years old. Right. But I think that in a subconscious way got very deep within underneath my skin.
Well, let's take a listen to the trailer to the miniseries. Take a listen to this.
I have been an inmate for 15 long years. I was convicted of murder when I was a young girl.
Good morning, Grace. I am a doctor that works not with bodies but with the mind.
Perhaps I'll tell you lies.
Perhaps you will. Perhaps you will tell them without meaning to. Perhaps you will tell them deliberately. Perhaps you are a liar.
There are those who said I am one. People want a guilty person. If there has been a crime, they want to know who did it. What it says at the beginning of my confession is true enough. I did indeed come from the north of Ireland.
Get out and send money back.
I tell you truly, you are surrounded by dangers here.
Now, I've had enough of your face.
You're very curious for such a young person.
It's strange to reflect that of all the people living in that house, I was the only one of them left alive in 6 months' time. It is not always the one who strikes the blow that is the actual murderer. I may have changed some of the details of my stories to suit what I thought you wanted to hear.
That's a clip from Alias Grace, the miniseries that airs tonight on CBC and on Netflix November 3rd. Sarah Polley is with me in studio. Alias Grace is about a woman who actually really lived. Grace Marks was the subject of great interest and intrigue, eventually convicted of murder in 19th century Ontario. And we know, I got to see the first 2 episodes of the miniseries, and I mean, it's a psychological thriller. Mm-hmm. There's also horror in there. Mm-hmm. But in the end, it just kind of feels like a tragedy. Were you trying to blend those genres all together in this?
I wasn't consciously trying to do it. I was very aware when I was adapting it that was much more plot-driven than anything else I've done that was actually, based on a book that makes you want to turn the page. Yeah. So there's actually a momentum to it and a reason to keep watching, which I'm unacquainted with. I usually just make slow, ponderous things that, put you to sleep.
Yeah.
So I was aware that all of a sudden I had a really exciting plot to work with. And that was thrilling. I think that, going into the genre of, a psychological thriller and horror was something that I knew I couldn't do as a director, which is why I asked Mary Harron to direct it. So I actually didn't direct this. I wrote it and produced it. Mm-hmm. And Mary Harron, who has an amazing sensibility, an amazing ability to create tone when it comes to much darker subject matter, really helmed it and really created the tone of the piece. So it wasn't a conscious effort to create a certain kind of genre as much as it was, I was still trying to get to the bottom of this book that had so hooked me, and that no matter how many times I went back to it, I couldn't understand it completely, and I needed to. So this was almost my process of I wanted to live in it and walk around in it and try to understand it.
Do you feel like you got there?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to have perspective on something you've worked so long on.
But do you feel like you got, if this is the process by which you were trying to understand this book you got when you were 18 years old, you're done now. I mean, the miniseries is shot. Do you feel like you have a great understanding of it that you didn't before?
Absolutely. I think it's hugely important to me. It's been hugely important in my life. And it feels kind of amazing to have it finally be done and out in the world.
I want to go back to something you said about the way we construct narratives for one another. And that goes for Grace as well. I mean, when you're watching this miniseries show?
Miniseries show. I don't know.
Whatever.
I don't know what people say on TV.
I'm new. I'm on radio. I just say broadcast. She's a murderer. She's an inhumane demon. She's an innocent. All these narratives are constructed for her. But I'm wondering how you see her.
I mean, I see her as impossible to pin down. I mean, I think what's so compelling about the book and what hopefully people find compelling about the show is that everyone walks away with something different. There are so many threads you can pull to create a particular story that you'll feel deeply committed to in terms of what happened or how innocent or guilty she is. You're going to disagree with the person next to you, which is what I find really fascinating about it, is that I think that these labels we put on people, I think especially women, we need to categorize, we need to pin down, we need to, categorize as either virgin or whore or, as she says, inhuman female, demon or innocent. I think that it's kind of this show and the book is kind of a study of that as much as it is of anything, of how can you pin down this one person? How could they be many, many different things at the same time, or are they one thing?
I read something you said about that when you talked about Mad Men. You said that Don Draper is considered to be this complex curative, which is a vegetable narrative, a complex character who cheats on his wife, but he also drinks, but he's also this complicated genius, and this is a complexity you don't necessarily see with women characters.
Well, I think when you do, you hate the character.
Right.
So I think that's what's interesting, is that Don Draper is a character that we all still kind of love, whether he has these foibles or not, whether he's capable of infidelity, if he's capable of all these things, we can still kind of love him despite his faults. But I think those faults in a female character, or indeed in like a female political figure, add up to mean bad. They mean that the whole sort of construction of that person crumbles upon that fault line, where I don't think we have the same feeling that men aren't capable of doing bad things but also being good people. So I think that that to me is sort of, it's just a cultural thing. And I think that they were dealing with it in the 1840s with Grace Marks, and we're still dealing with it now.
Yeah, and in Alias Grace, as now, bad things keep happening to women, and over again in big and small ways. There's a really poignant line about how sometimes the person who commits a crime isn't the one responsible. What do you think that line is saying about justice when it comes to women especially?
I'm not sure if I have a really good answer for that without putting a lot of thought into it, but I mean, I think that with Grace Marks specifically, I feel like, she was a woman who was prey, as most women of her class were in that time, and actually indeed of any class at that time. She was prey. She was completely not in control of her life. She was used. She was harassed and abused on every side. So there is a narrative you could pull of Grace Marks where she may or may not have murdered these people, but if she did, was it a form of self-defense, or was it a response to years and years of trauma, or was it a response to the situation she was living in? And I think that obviously there are a lot of parallels with contemporary cases where you can look at the situations women have been in and they're blamed for something, but it came as a result of a lot of extenuating circumstances.
Well, I could only imagine when you were making this miniseries, this broadcast, that you were thinking about Grace Marks, but you were also thinking about now as well.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I mean, I think especially now, I feel like it's relevant to look back at where we've come from and look back at women's history and how recent it was. And in fact, in many parts of the world and in this city, many women are living lives with very few rights and very few freedoms. And I think that is especially important right now when we're in danger of taking whatever we have won for granted, and those very things are at such risk.
It's very interesting that both Margaret Atwood adaptations kind of look at those two things.
Yeah.
Like Alias Grace is looking back,
Yeah.
and The Handmaid's Tale is looking forward. Does that cross your mind?
It does cross my mind, and I love that it's a way of contextualizing the space we're in right now and not taking it for granted, because I think these are incredibly dangerous times. And I think that it's easy to try to calm ourselves down and tell ourselves maybe it's not going to be so bad and maybe there's nothing to worry about and this terrible phase will blow over. Where you have a president of the United States who brags about assaulting women and is openly racist. But I think that that's where societies have gotten to extreme trouble before, is when you try to convince yourself it's not as bad as it seems. I think it's important to act as though it's as bad as it seems and to be vigilant. If
you're just tuning in, you're listening to Q on CBC Radio. I'm speaking with Canadian filmmaker Sarah Polley about her new adaptation of Margaret Atwood's novel, Alias Grace. I want to go back to what we were talking about in terms of history. Art can make history kind of accessible and bring it to life in a way that textbooks will say rarely do. It's different. I mean, you looked at the way the American Revolution was brought to life by Hamilton. For you, Alias Grace, how does it bring to life the 1837 rebellion in Canada?
Yeah.
Because I have to tell you, like maybe it's because I grew up in Newfoundland where we were taught a lot of Newfoundland history. I didn't know how cool the 1837 rebellion was.
It's so cool. So there's a remount right now of 1837 at Shaw, Rick Salutin's play. Right. And actually Rick Salutin was the person who introduced me to the whole history of the 1837 rebellion. And his book was a big source for me in adapting this as well. So it's an amazing story. I think it's actually more romantic and thrilling than the story of the American Revolution, but we don't know it because they lost. Maybe that's why it's more romantic and thrilling. But that was so exciting for me to bring. This takes place in the aftermath of the rebellion, and Grace's case was really conflated with the rebellion and made it her very political figure. And I think that was something that really drew me to it. And the idea of recreating Toronto in 1843, which I feel Mary Herron did so beautifully with Brendan Stacey, our cinematographer, it's an amazing, and Arv Gruel, our production designer, they created what I've always wanted to see. It was like, what did it look like when you got off the boat and, went up Church Street or whatever street we're going up? It was it was so exciting for me as someone who's always lived here to see that come to life.
Well, I think so too. I mean, I think you see that perspective a lot in like cities like New York. Oh, they get off the boat and they come into the harbor in New York City. You rarely get to see that in Toronto.
Yeah. Exactly.
Were you daunted at all to take on this novel?
I was extremely daunted. Yeah. I mean, it took a really long time. It was the hardest thing I've ever adapted or written. Partly because I love the novel so much and you don't want to fail the novel. And I think I realized halfway through writing it that I wasn't the right director for it. And that was also a process to go through, to realize that what I was writing wasn't something I was experienced enough to capture yet. So to go to Mary Herron and go, will you do this and will you take this on? Because I need someone who has this sensibility to take it to that next level.
Was that challenging for you at all?
No, I mean, once that I sort of realized I wasn't the right filmmaker for it, that became easy because I wanted to see it done right.
Right. Well, I mean, there is that temptation that, like, I've always wanted to do this, so I don't care if I am the right person for it. I'm going to do it. But obviously, you wanted to do it the right way.
Fear of Margaret Atwood is a powerful thing.
Tell me about it.
It's a powerfully motivating force in life.
Yeah, that's how I do every show every single morning, just under fear of a letter.
You do your best.
Yeah.
Because you don't want that lady mad at you. You just don't want it.
Did she give you any advice making this?
She was actually fantastic, and she did. She gave me an enormous amount of her time. She gave me enormous access to her resources in doing the research, and she was a huge support through the process and incredibly patient with it. It took a really long time. I mean, I tried to get the rights to this years and years ago. I had a child. I realized I wanted to stay longer at home with that child than I thought. I had another child. I realized again I wanted to stay home longer than I thought with that child. I was going to direct it. Then I wasn't. She put up with a lot and never stopped being supportive of the process and of me.
What's funny is that you talk about how long you sat with this project. And I don't mean sitting around waiting for it to get made, but sat down, internalizing it, conceptualizing, thinking about Grace Marks. And that's also what Margaret Atwood did when she wrote Alias Grace. She didn't learn about the story of Grace Marks and then go home and write it right away. I mean, she sat with it for a very, very long time as well. Well, what do you make of that?
I think she's a character that grabs you. She's so elusive. I mean, all of the historical record about her is so elusive. Like, she didn't leave any clues. She even at the end of her story, she disappeared. I mean, she disappeared to New York State and no one ever heard from her again. There's no trace. There's no record. Every record, document that's left can be left up to interpretation. I think she just keys into so much of the ambiguity we feel both about ourselves and the world. And at the heart of it is this insanely gruesome crime that she was either an accomplice to or committed or was the mastermind of or had little to do with. And we'll never know that. And also the sort of politically charged nature of this crime, because if you were poor Scots or Irish, you believed absolutely she was innocent. If you were gentry or English or upper class, you believed absolutely she was guilty and wanted her to hang. So it was really the O.J. Simpson trial of its time. It was enormously charged. The courtroom floor broke. There were so many people there to watch it. And it was all because it was this proxy for this rebellion that had been lost a few years earlier. So I think she was incredibly famous. People came from all over the world to like watch her, at the Queen Street Mental Health Center or at the Kingston Pen. So I think she just represents a lot of things. And I think that she'll never stop being fascinating.
I know that you're a filmmaker who believes in either a small way or a big way that sometimes explanation can harm work. That the idea that the more we talk about what things mean, it can detract from the actual experience of the art itself. That being said...
Explain yourself, woman.
Explain yourself right now. That being said, when people turn off the television this evening or they shut their iPads down, I sound like I'm 104 years old.
You really do.
When they shut down their internet, what questions do you want people to be asking one another after they watch these first couple of episodes of Alias Grace?
I mean, I don't know. I think what's been fascinating for me about watching people watch it as we've gone along through various cuts of the show is how much people disagree with each other. And that's what I sort of love about it. And that's what I was hoping for. I mean, I'm a big fan of shows like Serial where you end up arguing with people about you've heard all the same things and the same evidence, but you have completely different takes on it. So I guess what I hope for is that people disagree with each other. I think that starts to happen more as the series goes on and you're given more clues in terms of the crime. But I really hope that it provokes debate and I hope it provokes questions. And I hope it's unsettling in the right way.
Sarah Polley, thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much.
This has been very fun.
Yeah, really nice. Now turn off the World Wide Web.
Stop surfing the web, folks. Sarah Polley is leaving the building.